Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues, any other issues related to those issues. A hearty shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Join the nation by hitting that subscribe button, and if you want to support the channel in a more tangible way, hit the join button, and your membership options for citizenship will be presented to you. Today I'm continuing on my series on examining the case against God's existence. I just want to reiterate that this is my own personal exploration as an agnostic atheist. I don't necessarily hold all these views, but I am examining them and seeing if they have any merit or any usefulness as far as proving that God does not exist. We often hear on atheist channels the case for God's existence being challenged, but we very rarely, some people just put out the case against God's existence here and there, and I'm actually doing a deep dive on all the arguments against the existence of God here. Well, maybe not all of them, but a good chunk of them. And this is part 11. And what I'm dealing with today is the anthropic argument against God. Now, the anthropic argument goes something like this. If God is morally perfect, then he must perform the best moral actions, the morally best actions. In other words, the first premise basically says, okay, if you have a morally perfect God, then all of his actions would be morally perfect. And that's the way it would be. Okay, a morally perfect God isn't just a God that's morally perfect in theory as far as his head. He actually acts in such a way that is morally perfect. The second premise goes, though, creating humans is not the best moral action. Okay, when you look at human morality, as much as I think it's a lot better than religious people want to make it, we do have a lot of discussions about subjective morality versus objective morality. We have all kinds of different moral discussions that kind of indicate that morality is a little bit in flux, and it's a discussion item, and it's not morally perfect. There's not a perfection to humans' understanding of morality or their moral actions. Obviously, some human beings don't go, attack, morality in a positive way. They do morally despicable actions or morally questionable actions, and so we have discussions about whether something actions are moral or not. And humans exist. Okay, as the third premise. So therefore, a morally perfect God cannot exist. Some people say that God cannot exist at that point, but I have to remind the people making this argument, the anthropic argument, that their original premise was that a morally perfect God would perform morally perfect actions, okay, and human creation of human beings is not a morally perfect action, so therefore the morally perfect God does not exist. I think I did notice some atheists that use this argument didn't put the morally perfect in there, and that's part of the premise, okay, that's part of the issue. And so I think this argument calls into question that a morally perfect being would create human beings who are not morally perfect, okay? That there's something, the anthropic thing is all about, okay, if we have this morally perfect God, what kind of beings would he create? Well, he would create beings like himself that have a morally perfect understanding of morality. Some people think that this gets rid of God altogether, but it is actually, once again, a very specific attack on a very specific God. In particularly, it's an attack on the idea of God being morally perfect in some way. The best moral action that a God could make if he was creating beings would be to create morally perfect beings like himself. Now, there's a lot of obvious counters that I think theists would use on this one. That if God is all powerful, he would have the ability to create whatever kind of moral beings that he wants. But then, once again, how morally perfect would he be to create morally evil beings? And so, that calls into question whether or not God is morally perfect. So at that point, you could have a God that is not morally perfect but still very powerful or all-powerful, which would give you a deist God, or a God that's not necessarily benevolent or malevolent, just a God that has power and decided to create one day because he was bored. You could also drop the free will defense in here, that maybe God didn't desire morally perfect beings, but rather beings that could have a relationship with him instead of moral perfection, and so you got to give them choices, whether good or evil. The counter to this is you can still have morally perfect beings that have choices about relationships, and you could have them could still have the capacity to make relationship free will type decisions, but still be morally perfect. You didn't have to create the world or human beings with the capacity for evil to still have that. And the fact that human beings can conceive that that's possible indicates that God, if he were to exist, would also conceive that as a possibility. He would have the capacity to know that. So there's a lot of counter arguments that I see that theists could make about this argument, but I also see that there's counters to the counters. So what's my evaluation of this argument? I think once again we have an argument that attacks a very specific type of deity. If you have a deity that's believed in and worshipped that is supposedly morally perfect, I think I don't know that I would say that Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all propose a morally perfect God, and so I think this argument hits them pretty hard. Particularly the creation story that all of them run back to in Genesis 1 and 2 and Genesis 3, the fall of man, kind of gets hit by this argument pretty hard. Because it's saying, listen, your supposed morally perfect God created these very flawed human beings right out the gate, and they didn't have any good sense of morality. When you look, for instance, at the creation stories of those myths, the Adam and Eve story, you basically have God like dropping an open container of bleach with a couple of people that are 2-year-olds when it comes to morality and making moral decisions. They haven't really made any. They don't even know what good and evil is, supposedly, until they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So this doesn't bode well for that kind of creation story or anything like it, the Gilgamesh epic, anything where you have a claim that God is either the author of objective morality or is the source of objective morality or whatever, or he is morally perfect when he creates these morally imperfect beings. I think it is a very good argument at that point against that particular type of God. I think the monotheistic religions take a nasty hit from this one. Is it perfect? No. I mean, there's obviously some back and forth here with this argument, and so there's other objections that could be made. I'm just evaluating the argument, and so I don't know if I necessarily hold this argument, but I think it makes some very valid points against the idea of God being the author of objective or perfect morality. If he is, then perhaps the thing is, the idea here I think is, if God created beings like himself, the whole issue of morality wouldn't even come up as a discussion. It would just be a thing. It would be as real as the sun coming up in the morning, and that's just the way it is. However, this also brings up the other question of God. Does God declare something morally right? Because the argument kind of assumes that either moral perfection or objective morality exists outside of God and humans to be an evaluative judge of both. Okay, so is morality right simply because, and therefore God simply recognizes good morality outside of himself, or as it makes right, he declares it morally right, so therefore it's right. It brings up that question again. I don't think this does much against any pantheistic system or polytheistic system that doesn't declare God to be morally perfect in the first place. So the deist God gets off the hook because all we have with the deist God is a creator God, not necessarily the author of morality. Most polytheistic systems have some sort of discussion about morality within the system. So it's almost like they're acknowledging that morality is kind of a sloppy mess in the first place, in some cases. I think it provides some good additional ammo for the case against the moral argument for God. I think it calls into question the moral actions of God, because a lot of theists, when they make the moral argument, they sit there and they go, well, if objective morality exists, then God exists. Okay, objective morality exists, therefore God exists. The problem, of course, is is the connection between objective morality and God, does that exist? And this calls into question that connection quite hard. That if we had a morally perfect God, the connection to objective or moral perfection would be obvious, because human beings would be created that way and we wouldn't have any objections to that. And it would definitely, seem like the case for the moral argument would be better. But this kind of attacks it and makes that even weaker. I don't think that there is a good connection between objective morality and God in the first place, because I don't think any theist has ever bothered to make that connection really good. Okay, they've just assumed it. It's an assumed premise most of the time when I hear theists make that moral argument. I see very few try to make, justify that connection. And so you have that, and I think this kind of calls into question that conjunction in the first place and provides a good basis for that. So I think it has some better uses than most, particularly with the moral argument. I think it definitely attacks the idea of God being morally perfect, because if he was morally perfect, all of his actions could be shown to be morally perfect. And when you give, for instance, my former religion, Christianity, you look at the God of the Bible, there's definitely some questionable actions by God where there's this outside moral understanding that allows us to judge the character of God in the scriptures and say, hey, he's got some problems morally, that human morality is a little bit better. Things like slavery and genocide definitely come up as morally reprehensible actions. So there's that. So, I don't think it's perfect. I think it's better than most. I guess I would give it, like a C or something. C with some A points, some good points in it. So, I'll leave it at that. All right, thanks once again for stopping by. I'd be interested in hearing what other arguments you have for this in the comments. Once again, I'm just evaluating. I don't know if I necessarily completely hold any of these arguments that I'm making against the existence of God. I'm just evaluating them. Other people have made them, and I'm just looking at them. So, any like, share, subscribe, comment below is always welcome on this issue. So thank you very much. And as always, make sure you live your best life. You only get one go around, and then it's over. So make sure you're giving all your time, your talent, your money, your treasure, whatever it is that you do, to yourself and the people and you love and care for, and making this a better world. You'll be a lot happier if you do, and I speak from experience. And thanks once again for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.